Okay, let's start, everyone. Welcome to this community talk of March. Given that this is Women History Month, we wanted to dedicate this community talk to a topic focused on women and gender. Therefore, we'll discuss the research project Walking the Uncharted Path, Gender, Marital Status, and Climate Vulnerability amongst smallholder farmers in northwestern Ethiopia. We would like to welcome PhD scholar Dereye Amene Imam of the University of Gondar and Wageningen University. Also Tewelde Adhamnom, former assistant professor of University of Gondar and current director of Agora Consulting, and Nathalie Holvoet of the University of Antwerp. Before actually starting, allow me to do 3 practical announcements. Throughout the presentation, you can already raise some questions in the chats, and we'll make sure to come back to them during the Q&A. Also, during the presentation, please mute yourself. However, during the Q&A, feel free to raise your hand, and when given the floor, to unmute yourself, to put your camera on so you can direct your question directly to the presenters. And lastly, the community talk is being recorded, so that afterwards you can put the recording on our YouTube channel and you can rewatch it or distribute it among people who wish to listen to it. Voilà, so that was my introduction. So without further ado, let's dig in, and we hope you enjoy this community talk.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and welcome everybody to this talk of this month. So, as Laura already highlighted, this is a topic which is about gender, but here gender in relation to marital status and also the topic of climate change. So, I would like to go to the outline of the presentation. So, Tewelde, you please, yes, okay. So this is the outline of the presentation. First, we will give you some information on the project context and background, because the presentation we do is linked to a South initiative, which has been finalized, but the research was connected to the South initiative. I will also say something about the gaps in the literature, the objective of the research, some elements of a theoretical framework, and then Dereye, who is my colleague from Gondar University, but currently also with University of Wageningen, will go to the methods and the findings. And also Tewelde will focus on the findings which are from the qualitative data collection. And then I will say a few words about the policy and research recommendations and still highlight some key outputs of the project. So when we look at the project context and background, then in fact, you can go to the next slide, Tewelde. So when we focus on project context and background, then in fact, we start with the give some information on the project. So the project was in fact elaborated by a team of Flemish and Ethiopian colleagues. So I was there from University of Antwerp, IUB, and then we also had in fact Tewelde and Dereye and still other members from the University of Gondar. So the background is that, and this is something you might all be aware of, is the fact that Ethiopia is one of the countries that is in fact on the list of high climate change risk countries. And so, one of the things that is very obvious is the fact that this is to a large extent related to the fact that Ethiopia is highly dependent on agriculture. And so it has also been calculated that by 2050, the GDP growth, so GDP, that's gross domestic product, will be affected by 8 to 10%. What is also important to acknowledge is the fact that there is a high level of vulnerability to climate change, but that this level of vulnerability to climate change that one is not necessarily homogeneous across different sectors and across different gender groups, which in fact brings us to the topic of the research. So what is also important to know is that our research is policy relevant. Why is this the case? This is the case because Ethiopia is already doing or is already taking a lot of initiatives on adaptation. So meaning that the findings of our research could in fact also feed into these adaptation initiatives. So what we see is that, so for these adaptation strategies, and this is in fact not something that is unique to Ethiopia. This is, for instance, also something that we have noticed in Tanzania. We have done some similar research in Tanzania, where we have in fact noticed the same thing. So that adaptation strategies, that they tend to neglect the existing gender differences in perceptions, in vulnerabilities, and also in preferences of specific adaptation policies, and even more importantly, not only the existence of gender differences, but also the intersections with other factors of influence. And I will say something more about this when we move ahead in the presentation. So to highlight what we mean with intersection and why it is important to move beyond a gender mainstreaming approach, but also to take into account intersectionality. So now, so on the one hand, we have now covered the fact that indeed Ethiopia is affected by climate change. And of course, we have another component in the presentation, which is gender. And so what we know is that on paper, and this again is not something unique to Ethiopia, this is in fact something we notice everywhere in the world. Many countries have laws and policies which are related to gender equality, but then what we mostly see is some kind of policy evaporation. We mean with this that policies might exist, but that does not mean that policies are also effectively implemented. In many cases, in fact, implementation is lagging behind. There is one thing which is the laws and the policies, but of course, laws and policies are not elaborated in a vacuum. So we also have customary laws and practices, which in fact are still, and in fact, they are existing in parallel to national policies, but they often also undermine national policies, and which show in fact that in many parts of Ethiopia, gender equality is in fact still largely denied. So we have found during our first survey that we did in our study setting, we have seen that gender inequality is still very present, and so that the practice of the customary laws in fact is still very widespread, and it's clear that this is quite important. So when we move on in the presentation, as I have already mentioned, we do not only look at gender, but we also look at the intersection with other dimensions. And one of the most important dimensions we focus on is marital status. So this is again not, well, this is linked to the fact that we have done previous research on this topic, where we have seen that there is quite a big difference between, in fact, women of different marital status. And that is also the reason why we move beyond a pure disaggregation between men and women, but while we also take into account marital status. Okay, so then we go to the next. So this is the project context and background. Again, here you see where we have done specifically where we have done the research. So it is, the research was done in northwestern Ethiopia. So the link was in fact with Gondar University, which is in fact situated in this area. And so we have selected 3 different districts, which is Dabat, West Belessa, and East Belessa. So these are in fact 3 of the districts which are heavily affected by climate change, which is in fact also linked to the fact that they are focusing on rain-fed agriculture. So, and what is also typical is that they are less developed in terms of infrastructure, meaning roads, for instance. And so because of frequent drought, there is also high rates of deforestation. There are differences between the different districts, but I guess, so this is something that Dereji might go into later in the presentation. So Dabat, in fact, to be very brief on this, Dabat is the highland region. Then you have West Belessa, which is midland, and then we have East Belessa, which is lowland. And so they are three districts that are closely, so that are in fact in more or less closely connected to each other. So which in fact also makes it possible, also is important if you do comparative case study research, but there are also important differences between the three because of the fact that they are situated differently. And so if we look at the next slide, so yes, Tiveldi, yeah. So there we see gaps in literature, which in fact we have already mentioned. So there are vulnerability assessments, but in fact, these vulnerability assessments often do not disaggregate enough according to people that are differently positioned. There is also limited understanding of specific factors that contribute to intrinsic vulnerability. And there is also a lack of research on the intersection between gender and marital status, and certainly in relation to climate change and to intrinsic vulnerability. So this is in fact the gap in terms of theory and knowledge that we want to fill. Then in terms of methodological gaps, so our research is also innovative because it is in fact innovative because it makes another kind of operationalization of intrinsic vulnerability. And this is also something Dereje will explain later on in the presentation. So the idea is that vulnerability assessment usually focus mainly on numerical variables, but in our research, we also included non-numerical variables, so categorical variables. So, and there is also, as I have already explained, gaps in the policy domain. So our research is highly policy relevant because of the fact that currently adaptation strategies are being developed, and it is important that these adaptation strategies are targeted towards specific individuals. Otherwise, in fact, they might lead to policy failures or even to a worsening of the situation. So if we move to the next slide, then we see that the objective of our research was indeed to identify the most vulnerable households in northwestern Ethiopia in the three specific districts that we have selected, to investigate the intersection and the degree or the extent to which the intersection of a person's gender and marital status affects the level of vulnerability, and also to look into specific agricultural related adaptation preferences through this gender lens. Okay, so in terms of concepts and definitions, of course, this is a bit beyond the scope of the presentation to fully go into all these concepts and definitions, but the most important ones that you would need to understand the rest of the presentation is in fact those that come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so which is vulnerability. And the important what we want to emphasize here is the fact that we focus on intrinsic vulnerability, so not vulnerability that is affected by, in fact, by exposure to hazards, but it is in fact intrinsic vulnerability, which is part already of the system itself. And this intrinsic vulnerability is in fact linked to sensitivity on the one hand and adaptive capacity on the other hand. Sensitivity has to do with the degree to which a system or species is impacted by climate-induced shocks, either positively or negatively, and mostly it will be negatively, whereas adaptive capacity is referring to the ability of a system or species to adjust to potential damage, take advantage of opportunities, or respond to consequences. And of course, in this case, we are focusing on climate change. These are the definitions that are linked to climate change. When we look at the definitions linked to gender and, more importantly, intersectionality, it is the idea that gender, so that there are in fact indeed that men and women are in fact differently positioned in society, which of course also has an influence on the fact that they might have different adaptation preferences, and that they are also different, that their level of vulnerability might be different. But what is important here is that we move beyond these distinctions between men and women. We do not consider them as homogeneous groups, but we also take into account that there might be an interplay with other characteristics, with other background characteristics, social identities, elements of a social identity that men and women have. And the most important ones, usually when we do this in research, then we focus mostly on characteristics like marital status. Marital status meaning we distinguish between married men and women, those that are divorced, those that are widowed, and those that are single, because of the fact that these categories lead to people, to men and women, being differently positioned inside society. We also take into account age. So age, the situation of a young person is not necessarily the same as a situation of somebody who is older. Ethnicity might be an important element, but we did not focus on this in our research. And also education, lowly educated might be affected by might be differently affected than highly educated women. And then we, of course, also do not do our research in a social vacuum. We also have contextual factors that are important, like, as I have already mentioned, customary laws, but we also have an economy. Here, what is important is, in fact, that in this economy, the rural sector is in fact a quite important, the most important factor of the economy compared to the industrial sector and the tertiary sector. So the primary sector is a very important sector in Ethiopia. Politics are important, historical forces, as well as legal systems. And now I would like to give the floor to Dereji, who will continue with the presentation of the methodology. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Natalie. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, it's fine, Dereji, we can hear you.
Perfect. We are deeply honored and privileged to have the opportunity to present our research finding during this International Women's Month. And this significant occasion not only celebrates the achievements and contribution of women worldwide, but also it provides a platform to amplify the voices and experiences of women in the face of climate change, particularly in the context of our study in Ethiopia. So the study mainly relies on primary and secondary data sources. And cross-sectional, as part of primary data source, cross-sectional household survey was conducted to collect data on factors that contribute to the vulnerability of smallholder farmers in Ethiopia. And in parallel with survey data collection for focus group discussions with a total of 36 participants, which means 12 participants from each district, were conducted to capture more in-depth insights into the factors shaping vulnerability in the study areas. And then 6 key informant interviews were also conducted. And finally, we also conducted this reconnaissance survey to get preliminary data on socioeconomic and biophysical characteristics of the study districts. And we also used the knowledge and expertise of local communities and stakeholders, particularly to get some data on those factors contributing to the vulnerability of smallholder farmers in Northwest Ethiopia. And we actually conducted the pilot survey to optimize the quality, validity, and the reliability of the survey data, not only for this purpose, but also to identify any potential issues with the survey instrument, like whether there is ambiguity and confusing questions, and also to skip some kind of patterns. And also concerning the sampling procedure we used, the 3 districts were actually purposely selected based on the specific criteria and characteristics relevant to the research objective, which has been already mentioned by Natalie earlier. And within each selected district or agroecologist, 2 villages were randomly selected to ensure geographical representation and diversity. And within the selected villages, also respondents were chosen using systematic random sampling technique. And focus group discussion, participants and key informant interviews were actually purposely selected based on their relevance and expertise in the research topic that we already mentioned. And also, initially a total of 1,680 respondents were actually targeted for inclusion in study area. We employed a standardized sample size formula to draw this sample size. And after accounting for any inclusion and also dropouts during the survey, then the final sample size consisted of 1,630 respondents. So looking into the distribution of respondents among the final samples, 770 were male household heads, and 662 were married women within male-headed household, and the rest 181 were female household heads. Related to data analysis, we utilized a diverse range of data analysis techniques and tools in our research, including like categorical principal component analysis. And this categorical principal component analysis was used to generate object scores across the principal components of each indicators. And also, for the interest of time, I will skip all the methodological issues. Then if you have any question, then we can discuss it later. So we also used this logistic regression, binary logistic regression method to model the probability of a binary outcome variable of this, the level of intrinsic vulnerability of smallholder farmers against the explanatory variables that like the intersection of gender and marital status. So it is, we used these analytical techniques, and also we conducted this intrinsic vulnerability index to assess the inherent or intrinsic vulnerability of the smallholder farmers in Northwest Ethiopia. And we also use thematic analysis to identify analyze reporters patterns, and also the interviews we get from FGD and also key informant interview. Then the analysis was actually guided by both this intersectionality framework and IPCC AR5 framework. And we used the Kobo toolbox, Kobo Collect toolbox. It's a kind of, a mobile application data to collect our survey data. And we did that, CAT-PCA, we ran CAT-PCA using SPSS 25, because in the previous versions of SPSS 25 doesn't have any platform syntax to run this CAT-PCA. Then we also use this in vivo to analyze qualitative data. Then as a triangulation method, we used a peer review technique, and also, as a data validation and reliability checking methods, we use triangulation and peer review techniques. And also for Cronbach alpha and also interquarter agreement was used to check the reliability of our data. Next slide, please. Yeah, concerning the key procedures or steps typically involved in constructing this the intrinsic vulnerability index, First, we define the conceptual framework, what we mean really by intrinsic vulnerability, by referring this the IPCC AR5 framework. And then we identify key vulnerability factors, and we select indicators by conducting a comprehensive literature review and also by consulting experts, stakeholders who has knowledge on that specific issues. Then also we based on the report that we get from those 3 districts and also the reconnaissance survey we get, then we select indicators of the indicators which potentially are contributing, we thought contributing for this vulnerability of smallholder farmers in northwestern Ethiopia. Then we standardize the indicators. After standardizing the indicator, then what we did was just weighting the indicators using CAT-PCA by generating this the object scores. Then we finally normalize the indicators just to have a common scale or range, and to enable us, calculate the aggregated composite index for intrinsic vulnerability. Then finally, we aggregate and calculate the IVI. And based on that IVI level, then we categorize a different cutoff points based on the cutoff points that has been previously used by different, researchers, and taking into account the existing socioeconomic and biophysical characteristics of those 3 districts. Then we decide the cut pointers to say that a certain proportion of a population lies under highly vulnerable category, and the others lie under moderate category, and also the others on low level of vulnerability category. Then we did this logistic regression model finally, based on the formula that I already provided in the last slide. And next slide, please. Yeah, concerning the theoretical novelty of our study and methodological novelty of our study, as is already explained by Natalie, we already combined this IPCC AR5 framework and intersectionality frameworks as a theoretical framework to guide our research. Because the intrinsic vulnerability index is a very complex and dynamic issue, so that we combine this IPCC AR5 and also intersectionality framework to guide our research. Concerning methodological novelty, we already use comparative analysis across agroecology. We have this highland agroecology, midland agroecology, and lowland agroecologies. And also it allows us for comparative analysis, and also for it also increases this the external validity of our research finding. And also we use this mixed research design. We combine this qualitative data analysis technique with qualitative and quantitative data analysis techniques. So this is our methodological novelty. Then going to our finding. Next slide. Yeah, concerning, to give you a brief on the rainfall and this temperature trends of the 3 districts or the northwestern Ethiopia, we actually use this Mann-Kendall non-parametric test to show that, or to understand whether there is a decreasing or increasing trends in terms of rainfall and temperature over the 3 districts. So as you see from the slide, it's really difficult for me to show with a pointer, but let me explain a bit. So the study area experience highly, the first one shows about the Jawat districts, which is a highland agroecology zone. So it shows really that the erratic and irregular rainfall. So when we test the significance level, it is insignificant because the p value is greater than the alpha value. So and the second one is actually the midland. And looking into that graph, it shows a little bit a decreasing trend, but when we test its significance, then the p-value is still greater than the alpha value, so it is insignificant. But it doesn't mean that there is a climate shock over the area, but it really means that there is irregular and erratic rainfall patterns over the 3 districts. And looking into the temperature trend, as you see, there is, the black line, the solid line shows increasing trend. And even the R-square value showed that it's greater than 0.5, which means there is, an increasing trend of temperature over the 3 districts. The first one shows for the Midland, and the second one is shows for the highland area. So it shows that there is a significant increasing trend of temperature over the 3 districts. Then the next slide, please. Yeah, looking into this intrinsic vulnerability contributing factors. So as I told you, we already identify 36 key indicators for this intrinsic vulnerability contributing factors by consulting literature, consulting like experts, and also based on the reconnaissance survey we already did. Then, as Natalie already said, this intrinsic vulnerability is a combination of this adaptive capacity and sensitivity. So when we look at the first adaptive capacity indicators, then we already decide this cutoff point, like following the recommendations by different literatures, where based on the result that we get from CAT-PCA even, like the value ranging from minus 1.0 to minus 0.1 indicates a very high vulnerability, and minus 0.1 to 0.12 indicates high vulnerability, and etc. So we already decided, the cutoff point is like this. Then, as you see from the figure, the adaptive capacity index, like factors contributing to the low adaptive capacity at district level, then we see that first, the last, from the slide, you see the index value, the last column shows the index value for each variable, the last column. So the lower value means the higher, the lower value means that the lower the adaptive capacity of each household. Also, to mention some of them, like findings show a low index value like 0.06 related to the educational status of the household head. So this suggested that households with a lower adaptive capacity were particularly those with lower educational status. And also looking into the number of plowing animals in the northwestern Ethiopia, then it's also contributed fairly for high to it's a very high level of vulnerability of households with an index value of 0.07. So because these plowing animals are very essential in northwestern Ethiopia, as they are main input for, the input for agricultural practices in northwestern Ethiopia. Even looking into the number of, the number of plowing animal, the holders, then it is below even the national average. So and the other contributing factor is a social capital. Then specifically those these local financial institutions like EDR and DICO are also an important contributing factor to vulnerability, with a composite index value of 0.11, a kind of 0.068. So the composite index values of indicators and the subcategory of even crop diversification and crop yield like 0.9, 0.19, kind of 0.2 still shows that households with a limited accessibility in terms of diversified livelihood options are those who are highly vulnerable to climate change. Even the last one, input, access to input. So they lack access to fertilizer and also improved seeds. So these are all the contributing factors for a high level of vulnerability to the households and also to have a low adaptive capacity to climate change. And the next slide. And the second one is, as I told you, this intrinsic vulnerability index is a combination of capacity, adaptive capacity and sensitivity. And looking into sensitivity, these are the key indicators that we already selected to show whether households are sensitive to all these factors or not. Then, as you see, still those values with, values with negative signs are highly sensitive, factors. So looking for instance, like households, like, because of, for instance, looking into this access to water sources. So, people with households are really vulnerable because they are highly lacking access to water sources. Even looking into, those data from focus group discussion and key informants, people, they were reflecting that they were supposed to go, it's a long distance to fetch waters. And even this one is the responsibility of women and girls to fetch water. Not only this, also to collect, this fuel wood. As you know, 95% of Ethiopian source of fuel wood is, the source of energy is biofuel, or biomass energies. So, so long as the area is highly deforested, so they're supposed to go a bit far to collect fuel woods. So still, this is the responsibility of women and girls. And this has also a negative impact on, especially on girls, because they might, they might get absent from their education or class attendance. So these are some of the key factors under sensitivity, which contribute for households to be highly vulnerable for climate change. The next slide. So in terms of, overall this vulnerability, so our findings showed that the majority of households is falling within the very high to moderately high vulnerability category, with like 78% of those households having an index ranging from 1.03 to 0.35. So, and the less vulnerable households actually had an index value of 0.3 to 2.3 value. So the finding further indicate the Misraq Balasa or lowland agroclimatic zone had almost all, like 82% of the households in the very high to moderately high vulnerability categories. Also, by disaggregating the data further, than a cross-sectional survey result, like shows still like 81.97% of the households in midland areas were also classified under high to moderately high vulnerability categories. So as you see from that from the slide, the lowland area is highly vulnerable, followed by the highland areas. Next slide, please. Then looking into the intersectionality or intersection of gender and marital status in determining the intrinsic vulnerability of women intrinsic vulnerability of smallholder farmers, we disaggregate the data. Then the cross-sectional survey data showed that the sample village showed that nearly 74.5% of female household heads and 53.47% of women within male-headed households, and 52% of male household heads were found to be highly vulnerable to climate change, while the rest are classified under least vulnerable. Least vulnerable to climate change or climate-induced shocks. And the next slide. Yeah, this one is actually the model we run to show that which marital status category or which gender category is highly vulnerable to climate change. Then here our key explanatory variable of interest are the interaction of marital status and gender. We include actually 6 demi-variables like married male household heads, divorced female household heads, married women within male-headed household, etc. So with the 6 demi-variables, and the key outcome variable here is in the study is actually the level of the level of respondents' intrinsic vulnerability. So during the regression analysis, actually, less and highly vulnerable respondents were assigned a value from 0 to 1, respectively. Then in the first model, as you see, gender and household headship were modeled with the outcome variable, which is a level of actually intrinsic vulnerability. Then as you see from the table, female household heads in model 1, So female household heads are more likely to be highly vulnerable to climate-induced shocks compared to women within male-headed households, because here the reference category is married women within male-headed households. So more specifically, it means that female household heads are 2.553 times more likely to be intrinsically highly vulnerable than women within male-headed households. While male household heads are 0.98 times less likely to be intrinsically highly vulnerable than women within male-headed households. Then in the second model, then the intersection of gender with marital status was modeled with the outcome variable of this, whether the outcome variable of the level of vulnerability, high versus low. So using here, the reference category is widowed female household heads. So as you see from the table, the level of vulnerability vary by the intersection of marital status and gender, with only divorced female household heads feeling greater insecurity to climate-induced shocks compared to the widowed female household heads. So it is nearly 2.73 times more likely to be highly vulnerable compared to widowed female households. Then all other gender or marital status categories are actually likely to experience low vulnerability. Like for instance, married women within a male-headed households are 0.65 times less likely to be vulnerable than widowed female household heads. So compared to the widowed female household heads, married women tend to have more access to resources in the village through their marriage and ties to their husband, actually. Then similarly, divorced and widowed male households were also modeled in model 3. And actually they are almost in the same category. So as you see, it's nearly, for widowed male household heads, like 1.057, and for divorced male household heads, 0.947. So it's almost the same. So this result confirms that marital status does not really matter for men in determining the inherent level of vulnerability of smallholder farmers to climate-induced shocks in northwestern parts of Ethiopia. In model 4, those respondents in age category were also modeled, like the age category between 31 to 45, age category between above 45 and below 31. So those respondents in the age category of age 45 were 0.67 times more likely to be highly vulnerable than those who were in the age category between 18 to 30. So because the reference category is those households in the age category between 18 to 30. And also agroclimatic type as a covariate was also modeled in model 5 to see whether it determines the level of vulnerability to climate-induced shocks. So those respondents living in East Belasa, which means lowland agroclimatic zones, are almost two times, more likely to be vulnerable than those households in midland agroclimatic zone, because our reference category was this midland agroclimatic zone. Similarly, respondents living in the highland agroclimatic zones are 1.163 times more likely to be vulnerable compared to those living in the midland agroclimatic zone. And the last one is actually, after controlling all these socioeconomic variables, we modeled whether still there is a significant difference in terms of the marital status and age, the interaction of age, gender and marital status. Still, it determines, for instance, the divorced females are 1.7 nearly times more likely to be vulnerable compared to the reference group. Next slide, please. Looking deeper into, the intersection of gender and marital status, this is actually what we get from during the focus group discussion that we conducted in the 3 districts. For instance, a divorced woman age 38 in Dawat, or this highland agroclimatic zone, were saying, due to this customary law of the district, I could not possess land and cattle from my former husband when we separated. I took only home utensils like cooking pots and also some kilograms of cereal crops. So getting divorced is viewed as bad, which they see as a female, seeking to. So the situation doesn't allow us to practice in decision-making process of socioeconomic affairs of our villages, and also to get safety net benefits from the district. This makes more vulnerable to frequent droughts than have been happening in our district. So this one is actually the qualitative data we get from Dabat district. So the customary law is one of the contributing factors for those divorced female women's to be intrinsically vulnerable to climate-induced shocks. In the other women in, for instance, West Balasa or Midland agroecology say also, married women don't like me. They think I may seduce and sleep with their husbands. If I want to wear new clothes, I can't dress it in public. So I panicked because they might think it is a gift from one of their husbands. So it is really, the other contributing factors, the image they get from the married women. So this is also the other contributing factor for their vulnerability level. And from East Veles, our lowland area, we get the same result. A woman, also divorced woman, she was saying that I had been marginalized from the women's local association and other activities in the village. So this is also the other driving factor for them to be vulnerable to climate-induced shocks. So for more, I think, technical issues or methodological aspects, or if you have any question, then we can discuss later on after Tolda's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daraja and Professor Natalin, and I really appreciate for the generous fund of VLUS for this project, and thank you for the opportunity that you provide us to present as well. So just to follow up on the comparison of adaptation preference by different groups of people and 3 agroecological zones that we have conducted in the highlands of Dabat and West Belasa of Mid Highland, as well as the lowlands of Eastern Belasa. We tried, as you can see from some of the pictures, we tried to categorize women-headed household alone, as well as trying to mix some of men and women, as well as we are also had FGD with only female living with a male-headed household. So the result shows us there is distinct difference between even female-headed household as well as female within the male-headed household, but largely the difference is significant when you see the adaptation preference of those women in general and male farmers. And of course, there is a difference on types of adaptation strategy. Those different ecological zone areas prefer to use the adopt with shock. So when we see, for instance, the female within male-headed household in Dabat, that's a very lowland part of Ethiopia, which animal husbandry, poultry, and livestock productions are common, where the female within the male household prefers to have poultry as adaptation strategy, whereas when we compare to male, it's more of livestock, which this clearly shows the gender role as well as the available opportunities those women can easily adopt to improve their livelihood and, of course, to adopt with shock that happens. So there is also distinct difference between the preference of people on adaptation strategy between the lowland and highland areas, where animal is common on the lowland area of Dabat, whereas in the lowland part of Eastern Belasa, it's common to see fertilizer and small income generating activity as the main adaptation strategy preferred by the community. Of course, in the midland of Belasa, particularly by female-headed household, safety net as a donation or work for food or cash was something that was an outlier from the group discussion that we were able to grasp. This is more of very participatory approach where women and male of different gender mixing together and separately come up with those competing priorities that they give into adaptation strategies that you can see in the table. The same is true. We try to compare the adaptation strategy among men and women, and you can see from the spiral diagram that the preference of female, which you can see in a brown color, is dominantly into a distinct gender role of women, where dominantly on poultry, small business, vegetable, as well as a little bit towards natural resource. And of course, fertilizer is a common, but dominantly needed by women. Whereas when we see the male preference to adaptation strategies, it's dominantly aligned with their gender privilege as well as preferences, like on diversifying crop, on natural resource management, and of course, improving their farm management and getting more grazing land, and so on. So these are something interesting comparison that you can see, and there is distinct difference between gender on adaptation strategy preferences. Of course, as you saw in this table as well, there is a little bit of difference between female-headed household as well as women living within the male-headed household. I will, for the sake of time, just will proceed to Professor Nataline to proceed with the next presentation. Over to you, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Tibeldi. So in terms of conclusions and policy implications, I will be very brief. So what has been shown is that this kind of intrinsic vulnerability analysis, so that this is in fact a very useful framework to identify the most vulnerable households, so households and individuals, because we here show that we go beyond the household level. And so also to identify then factors that lead individuals and households to be more or less vulnerable, which is also in fact very useful information if you want to identify to whom you should target your to whom you should target your programs. So as we have seen here, so you can go to the next slide, Tiveldi. So what we have also shown is that indeed there is a difference between differently positioned men and women. So what is important is that this is also not only a finding that we have identified in Ethiopia, but for instance also in Tanzania, that within, in fact, for men, it does not matter so much their marital status, but for women, marital status is quite important. So in fact, it shows that the most vulnerable are in fact the divorced women. So which is due to the fact that they are often excluded from, for instance, social capital in the sense of excluded from networks, which is quite important if you have to cope with climate change. We have, of course, limitations. This is cross-sectional research that's not longitudinal, which means that in terms of causal directions, so in fact, these causal directions are unclear. So it would be useful to have, in fact, longitudinal data. And then, in fact, what we also did not do, we did not further disaggregate, for instance, between women, the first women, second women, and third women, which in when you have polygamy, which might also be an interesting disaggregation. And then in terms of the major outputs of our project, which is on the next slide, so we have academic publications. And as you see here, for instance, there is a publication in Climate and Development. So we have academic publications, but even, well, we also have, we have done trainings of the research team. We have also done trainings with stakeholders. We have done inception workshop, and at the end also dissemination workshop and conference. So thank you for the presentation. It's 12 o'clock, so just in time. If there are questions, you are welcome to ask questions. Okay, thank you. I think we can give the floor back to Laura.
Laura, we can't hear from you. I think you are muted.
Laura or Christophe or Veerle, I think they are the ones from US who are in fact leading the session from US. So
yes, I have one small question.
Go ahead.
Okay. So it's I find it a very interesting study. It employed diverse methodologies and analysis. I really appreciate it, but my point here is just one thing that catch my attention regarding the result on the vulnerability. For example, I'm not sure whether it's I understand it right or not, but I can see that widowed women and married women have a relatively similar vulnerability than divorced. So if that's the case, it would be interesting to know what would be the cause. What would be the cause? Maybe if you catch some information from the focus group or somewhere, it would be nice to know why widowed women have a similar exposure than married. Then what about divorced? I would expect divorced. Okay, divorced also have high vulnerability, but what about widowed? It has something which I don't understand, and it would be nice to discuss on that. And what would be your recommendation on this point for policy implication, for example? And in general, what is a recommendation of this research for policy makers or for any intervention? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I can maybe start by responding, and then my colleagues Direggi and Tiveldi can maybe further add. So I think that the slides have shown, so the findings have in fact shown that the category that is most vulnerable is the group of divorced women compared to married and also widowed women. And in fact, the reason behind this, and this is also, I think, was also explained on the slides with the information from the focus group discussions. In fact, the reasons behind this is that divorced women, or in fact, you could say that there is a kind of social stigma on divorced women, which leads them, in fact, to have less access to all kinds of factors which are useful to cope with climate change. For instance, less financial capital, less social capital, which in fact is very clear from what is mentioned here. So they are often excluded from existing networks, which in fact is often useful to cope with climate change. And this is a situation that is in fact more affecting the divorced women than the other categories of women. So this is in fact what, and then in terms of policy implications, I think it is very useful for policymakers to understand in fact that differently positioned individuals, and this can be due to the fact of gender, but also, as we have shown here, due to the fact of a different marital status, that differently positioned individuals are also differently affected, and that you also need to take that into account when you have, for instance, adaptation, when you elaborate adaptation policies, that these are not homogeneous policies which consider different individuals as, in fact, having the same preferences, being similarly affected by climate change, but to take that into account that there are differences, and so that you also need to take that into account when you elaborate policies. So this is, I think, what I could answer to your question. But I also invite Direggi and Tiveldi maybe to further add on what I have just mentioned.
I think you have covered it very well. I think we can proceed to next question, maybe.
Direggi, would you still like to add something, or shall we move to the next?
Yeah, I mean, it would be redundant. I think you already addressed it. Like, just we found that divorced female household heads are most, I mean, highly likely to be vulnerable because as we get from the FGDs, divorced female household heads said that they are vulnerable because they are particularly disadvantaged in terms of in terms of materially with a lower level of like income, access to resource and assets compared to married and widowed women as well. Divorced women in the study areas are economically marginalized and usually engaging in informal sectors like selling homemade products. So like maybe collecting wood and selling it to others. So while there is some, I mean, counter evidence like in some parts of Ethiopia, this category of women are, I mean, have advantages in terms of like, because we have a kind of, I mean, different cultures and also norms in Ethiopia. So the culture we have in Northwest Ethiopia is completely different that we have in the center. So like, I mean, what Natalie has already said, they are disadvantaged because they are excluded from any other social activities. As we got from this FGD or focus group discussions, they say that even those married women, they think that they may seduce their husband or sleep with them, a kind of, so they are excluded from any activities and also, I mean, these social engagements. So that's why they are highly vulnerable compared to other groups. So in terms of policy recommendations, then any adaptation, like, I mean, these policymakers need to pay attention, I mean, specifically for in northwestern Ethiopia, because the trend and the tradition might be different for other contexts. But for that part, policymakers need to pay attention for divorced women when they come up with a kind of adaptation strategies in that area. Yeah.
Thank you.
Professor, would you prefer for us to read the questions in the chat or to give chance those who raised their hand? Francisca has raised her or his hand.
I'm
Afternoon.
sorry, there was something wrong with my microphone, but can you hear me now?
We can hear you now very well.
Yes.
Oh, perfect, perfect.
Yeah, but we took over the session a little bit.
Yeah, I saw it's perfect, perfect. Maybe due to time, I would propose to have a last question of Francesca Benson, and then maybe we should close out the session. Francesca, the floor is yours if you want.
Okay, afternoon, everyone. My question, I listened through everything, but I feel like there's something that wasn't highlighted. So my question is on how can we work towards addressing the gender imbalance in the population in order to better combat the impacts of climate change and create more sustainable and equitable solutions for all individuals involved? Hello?
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for your question. I can answer, but I would prefer that maybe now we first give the floor to the colleagues from Ethiopia. But I can also add further to what they are saying. But maybe you would like to start first, Dereji or Tiveldi, to respond to the question of Francesca.
Daraja, over to
you
you,
want
I
to
guess.
say something or?
Please proceed, Daraja. I was looking into those questions in the chat. Sorry. Over to you, Daraja.
Okay, as we already mentioned before, this the level of vulnerability for different gender categories is different, and also even when we intersect it with marital status, it's more even, I mean, more different. So in terms of addressing this, the challenges or the impacts of climate change, particularly on these gender imbalances, we already said that these decision makers and key actors, be it individual, group, or organization, they should take into consideration all these factors like the driving, for instance, what are the driving factors which put us those special, like we already said that the divorced females are more vulnerable than other categories. So what are really the driving factors? So the policymakers need to really address those driving factors in order to address the challenges of climate change, I mean, in that areas. So my perspective is that instead of addressing all the symptoms, but policymakers need to really address those root causes and also driving factors that we already mentioned before. What are the driving factors or contributing factors for those people's to put them or to have them low adaptive capacity and to be highly sensitive for a certain climate-induced shocks. So we need to really pay attention for those all driving factors or root causes instead of addressing those symptoms. So that is my, I think, reflection from my side. And Natalie, proceed, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dereji. I would like to add on what you are saying. So I think we should maybe make a distinction between the short term and the long term. So I think in the short term, indeed, what the presentation has shown is that, in fact, vulnerability is caused or is linked to a number of drivers of vulnerability. And that is, for instance, access to different types of capital. So it could be financial capital, human capital like education, and also social capital. So I think it is important that when you have these kinds of policies, that you make sure that, for instance, financial capital, that you or access to fertilizers, that you specifically target towards this category of divorced women, because we know that they are in fact most vulnerable, and we have insights into the factors that are influencing vulnerability. So we should make sure that especially this category of divorced women in fact has access to these different types of capital that might have, in fact, that might lower vulnerability. This is, I think, important to do in the short run. But of course, as we have mentioned, there is also this important factor of social capital. And so this is, I think, where we need to think more on the longer term. And this then, what comes in at that moment is, of course, a more focus on gender awareness training. So in fact, and this is something that you cannot change overnight. And so gender relations is not something that you can change overnight, but where you need more long-term strategies, like, for instance, gender awareness, education. So I think important indeed to make that distinction between short and long-term, and target policy specifically to the category of women, which has been shown here to be most vulnerable, which is the category of divorced women. But I think maybe we should give the floor back to Laura.
Yes, I think, yeah, given the time, we could close off. Obviously, this is a topic that raised a lot of interest, and that we could go on discussing, but allow me indeed to thank you all for attending the community talk. Thank you for your attention, for your participation. And again, my apologies for the technical issue on my behalf at the end. But we value this community talk, and we believe it's very useful to share experiences and insights. I would also want to give a special thanks to the speakers, Dereye Amene Imam, Tewelde Athanom, and Natalie Holwood for their insightful presentation and the discussion afterwards. This research project covered an important topic, and as mentioned in the introduction, not only in Ethiopia, but in the wider region. So this community talk has been recorded so that we can share it afterwards on our YouTube channel. So don't hesitate to visit our website to rewatch it. And then lastly, I would also like to already welcome you for the next community talk that will take place on Wednesday, April 24th And by coincidence, this will also cover a topic on Ethiopia, and more specific on the ecological restoration and sustainable integrated farming. This is a collaborative project of researchers of Arba Minch University and the KU Leuven. So please stay tuned, check out our website and our social media network platforms to stay up to date. And other than that, we wish you a really nice day and hope to see you next time.
Laura, maybe, I have got a lot of questions, methodological questions through my email. So is that also possible to put, we already published 2 articles in a peer-reviewed journal. So for better clarification on those methodological aspects, then they can refer those articles. So can we also put a link on somewhere on this platform? Is that possible?
Yes, you can send it to me, and then I will also put it on the website so that people can either rewatch the video, the presentation, and also read the publication.
Perfect.
Maybe I should intervene, Direji. One of the presentations has a copyright, so I think we should take care with putting that on a public website. So, but we probably can find a solution for this, but the one is open access, so for that one it's not a problem. For
Okay.
Climate and development, I think this is indeed the most important one, which is mostly linked to what we discussed today, but that one has copyright on it. So maybe there we should share a version that but maybe this is not a fully public website, then it might not be such a problem. But we have to take care with this.
Yeah, and for people interested more on the individual level, I would say never hesitate to email to info@fleros.be, and then we can see case to case what is possible and discuss.
Yeah, we can share the article on a case-by-case basis. That is not a problem, but we can put it on public websites.
Makes sense. Okay.
Great. So a lot is still ongoing on this topic. That's really nice to see. And that's all for all aim of this kind of talks. So again, always welcome to email us info@fleros.be, and then we can discuss this further. And if what you want, we can refer you to the presenters individually. And obviously you can find more information on our website. So have a nice day. Hope you enjoyed this community talk, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.